Thank you, Lori. It's great to be here again at Gateway City Arts, a fantastic place, and it's great to have you here tonight for our presentation with Radiotopia, The Great God of Depression. Just a show of hands, how many people have listened to one part or all of the series, besides the producers? Okay. Well, for those of you who haven't, and those who are hearing it again, it's really a fantastic piece. They've done a spectacular job. You heard some of the music that was written for it. It's also just a great piece of work, and I think you're in for a great treat this evening. I also want to let you know that we recently launched our own podcast hub. You can go to our website. We have 11 podcasts, including Valley Voices. We have Carrie Healy with our State House reporter, Matt Murphy, every week. So check that out. You're going to hear a lot of great podcasts, and we hope we can do more in the future. This is a, kind of a unique event because you probably do most of your listening in the car or at home or maybe in the office. So to have all of you come together and listen together and then be able to interact with our panel is kind of a unique thing, and I hope we can do more of this in the future. Karen Brown is our senior reporter at NEPR. She focuses on healthcare, mental health, children's issues, and other topics about the human condition. She's been a reporter at New England Public Radio since 1998, and she's won numerous awards, including the National Edward R. Murrow Award and the Erickson Prize for Mental Health Reporting for her body of work on mental illness. And I was honored to be at the award in Boston given as the for journalist under 40. I won't say how many years ago that was, so I don't give away. But she was the first recipient of the Daniel Shore Prize. And she's here tonight with Pagan Kennedy and everyone else from Radiotopia. So I am pleased to introduce to you Karen Brown.
Thank you, Martin. That was very kind of you. And I'm going to go ahead and bring our panelists up just as we get going before we start listening. So why don't the four of you come on up, and I will let you guys know a little bit who we're going to be hearing from today. And thank you all so much for coming. And I also want to thank the creative team from Radiotopia for coming all the way from the Boston area. Hopefully they will continue to come. You guys can take seats. And also to Audio Hearth, which is a great organization, a great group of listeners of experimental audio and all sorts of audio types in Western Massachusetts, and they helped us spread the word, so we thank them also. So we are about to play the first episode of The Great God of Depression. This chapter is called The Night Kingdom, and then we'll have a discussion with this panel, followed by some questions from the audience, and then a reception with yummy food from Gateway City Arts, courtesy of NEPR, and there's a cash bar, which I think some of you have discovered, which is always a good thing. But first, I want to introduce the panel. And you may want to think a little bit as I tell you sort of what everyone's role was in the project, if you have any particular questions after we listen for what their particular role in the program was. I will just start with me again, even though Martin did very kindly introduce me, but just to let you know, I've been doing this work for about 20 years, and I often cover a lot of breaking news stories, but the types of stories sort of nearest and dearest to my heart tend to be long-form, documentary-style health and mental health stories. The Great God of Depression is my first narrative podcast, and that's thanks to Pagan Kennedy. She and I, about a year ago, hatched this idea for the podcast, and it's sort of amazing that we managed to finish it, and here we are. If you stay through to our bonus episode at the very end, that's the only place you'll hear my voice. That's when I trudged down to New York City to meet the actor Tony Shalhoub and talk about William Styron and his story. and his own experience portraying a mentally ill character. So that's a highly voluntary activity for anyone that wants to hang out later. So let's start with Pagan Kennedy is a writer of many books, columns. She's a regular contributor to the New York Times, and she's my co-producer on this podcast. She's also the main narrator and the main writer, too. Pagan, I'm hoping you can give us a brief introduction on what you do. And
what I did for this podcast?
well, what you do
Or
in general.
Well, okay. Obviously, you can tell that I'm not native to the audio format. I'm a print journalist. Whoop. Is this going in and out? Okay. I'm a print, have been a novelist, a print journalist, narrative nonfiction writer, and have been a tremendous fan of audio and podcasts. So it was very exciting to move in. It's kind of going in and out. And just, so thankful to this amazing team for hand-holding me through the whole process. Okay. So
we may switch out mics if it doesn't work, but yeah. We'll go with that for now. So next is Alice Flaherty, who is the doctor that we feature in this podcast, who you'll hear in a few minutes, who's been generous and open not just about her work with William Styron, but her own struggles with mental illness. And Alice, your professional life is fascinating, and I'm wondering if you could just briefly kind of tell us a little bit about what you do.
Well, it's probably a little less fascinating to me. I'm a doctor at Harvard Medical School. I started out in neurology at Mass General Hospital, and then I kind of drifted over to the dark side, which is what my chairman called it when I got a joint appointment in psychiatry. And that was after I had basically had a big manic break when I was a fellow. And in terms of openness, the psychiatry department they were like, we're all sick, come join us. They were incredibly helpful. But I do feel a little bit like, there's a great line that Vladimir Nabokov said about, he had applied for a job at Harvard in literature, and after reading some books, and they said that getting a writer to teach literature is like having an elephant teach zoology. And I feel a little bit like that when I see psychiatric patients, because basically most of what I know is just from taking the pills, and I have not all that much formal training, but I did learn a lot from my own doctors and from going to the lunches in the psychiatry department, which were way better than the neurology lunches.
So now we know about the food. I like that. Next up is Julie Shapiro, and she is the reason any of us are here tonight. She runs the podcast network Radiotopia, which is a part of PRX. It's a wonderful network. They have the Showcase feed, which is what our podcast is on, but they have many, many other weekly podcasts. And Ear Hustle, you may have heard of. That's also a Radiotopia production. And it was her decision to take a chance on the great god of depression, which we're very grateful she did. So I'm wondering if you can tell us, Julie, a little bit about what your role is generally at Radiotopia and a bit about the Showcase program.
Sure. Well, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you to NEPR for being such a great partner on this series, and to the team, which was amazing to work with, and to all of you for coming. So I'm executive producer of Radiotopia, which means I get to work with the most amazing producers in the world, in my opinion. We have 19 shows. They're largely storytelling shows, but we're sort of expanding what we're doing now. But they all are independently owned, fiercely creative and bold. And so what I do is help them make their shows, not creatively. They all have independent control of what they put out, but we help with sponsorships and technology and promotion, all the things besides the content that podcasting is about these days. So that's Radiotopia. Primarily, we have ongoing shows. If you maybe you listen to some of them, you would think that. But a couple of years ago, we started thinking about all these wonderful ideas that didn't need or didn't necessarily want to be ongoing shows, but that could sustain through multiple episodes, but didn't necessarily need to be their own feeds. And what we developed was this Showcase feed, which showcases limited series, one after the next, by different producers from all around the world. So we're sort of on the hunt for creative ideas that would push the form a little bit. We could take some chances, we could experiment, we could bring new talent to the podcast world. And Showcase has become just that, a series of series, very different one to the next. And when this idea came to me, I thought it would be a really great fit for the Showcase feed. And we can maybe talk about that a little bit later. So anyway, really glad you're here. And I'm going to make a plug for the bonus episode because it's really delightful. You should stick around for that.
Thank you, Julie. And Ian Coss is a sound designer and musician who grew up in Western Massachusetts and now makes music and designs audio programs in Boston. Can you tell us how you started to score podcasts?
Sure. Well, it's great to be here at this NEPR event. I grew up listening to NEPR as a kid. And how did I start scoring podcasts? Well, I started scoring this one. Almost, it's not entirely true, but it's, I guess the point is that podcasting, and especially sort of sound-rich, scored podcasts, is kind of a new and evolving art form. So there aren't that many shows out there quite like this. But I grew up playing music. I went to Pioneer Valley Performing Arts Charter High School nearby here, where I studied music, PVPA, and at some point got the radio bug and realized that my background in music could find a really exciting and new kind of platform in podcasting. So really happy to be here.
And we really felt like Ian was definitely the third producer because the sound design is so integral to how this piece works. So now we're going to put down the lights a little bit and we're going to listen to the first chapter of The Great God of Depression. We will sit down and listen with you guys, and then we'll come back up again later.
Just a quick note before we start. This series discusses mental illness and some other sensitive topics that might not be appropriate for all audiences.
Chapter 1, The Night Kingdom.
We've just passed through the iron gate that leads into the land of the dead. My friend Alice Flaherty unfurls a map.
We're about here. What's the scale?
Alice loves maps.
It's like 600 feet. It's not far.
I've known Alice for about a decade now. My name is Pagan Kennedy, and I'm a science journalist, as well as a connoisseur of odd people. Alice is definitely odd. She's also a highly respected neurologist.
So we put our bikes in the rack, and then we walked down towards the place that I had picked out.
She taught me that our minds are full of rabbit holes that can send us tumbling into other realities. Alice knows. She's been down her own rabbit hole. There are medical names for what happened to Alice back in 1998, but she prefers an old-fashioned word, madness, because her delusions seem like they came from a 19th century novel, or a place like this one.
It's so easy to get lost here, even though I've been here 100 times.
Now we're sort of bushwhacking through the cemetery. Alice takes a shortcut, and we have to duck under some tree branches. We pass the entrance to a mausoleum that burrows into the hillside. It looks like a doorway into the underworld.
And the landscape is so studded with memories. And there's actually a huge kind of multiple person mausoleum where there are a lot of dead young children. I don't know if it's coincidence or what, but you can see that they have like 50 times more flowers than anybody else, and parents have been visiting. Ever since their children died, like 20 years ago.
We're here because Alice wants to show me the most important evidence of her madness.
Oh my God, I think no, this isn't it. No, that's not a pond, is it? Let me just check. think this might be it. Now I'm sort of disoriented. Yeah, this is it. There was a row of bushes here, and there's only one bush left now. But I would guess that they are just about there.
She leans over and peels back some frozen leaves. Then she stands up and tells me this is the exact spot she picked out 20 years ago.
I had a folding army shovel, and
this is where she buried her unborn twins.
I probably dug half of the hole, and Andy dug the other half. And then we put them in, and we covered it up, and, we tried to stamp it down pretty hard so that it would look, and cover it with leaves so it would look authentic and undisturbed. I sort of wanted to have a gravestone, but I sort of couldn't, of course. So I just crossed some sticks.
The sticks that Alice left here are long gone, of course. When I squat down to study this place, all I can see is dirt. But that's how it is with doorways into other worlds. They masquerade as ordinary things. This secret grave marks the beginning of Alice's search to understand her own mind. And that quest will lead her to a man who holds the clues. This is The Great God of Depression, a production of Showcase from PRX's Radiotopia. It's the story of two conjoined minds. One of those minds belonged to a famous author who transformed the way we all think about mental illness now. And the other mind belongs to Alice. By the end of the story, you'll have encountered 3 cemeteries.
I've always been fascinated by graveyards. I think people born in the South are.
A suicide note.
I hope to make it through, but in case I do something to myself, I trust you will make the...
Frank Sinatra, Virginia Ham, a lost check in a Paris restaurant, a public confession in the New York Times, and, of course, Alice's madness. But before we get to all of that, we need to jump back in time.
Well, I would say 1998 was when it all started.
Alice was a rising star in science with a grant to study how the brain talks to the body. She was also seeing patients at Massachusetts General Hospital, and she was pregnant. Late at night in the hospital, she would sneak into the sonogram lab and rub the wand across her own belly. In the display, her twin fetuses floated through the blackness of herself. They were baking themselves into babies, and they seemed to be doing just fine. But that changed in an instant.
I remember walking down the basement steps carrying something and just having this sudden realization, like, holy shit. Not panic, but like just a sense of doom. Like that was the end of this pregnancy, even though I didn't quite know that yet. So immediately I went in to the hospital and I sat in the outpatient waiting room to see my obstetrician. And I was sitting on the chair. I remember the dress I was in, and I was still leaking fluid.
When the nurse called her name, she rose woozily to her feet.
So when I got up, there's this big wet stain of my baby's amniotic fluid on this chair. They were old enough that the one that came out alive could hold my finger, but they were, 4 months older before they could have survived.
Maybe it was hours later, maybe days later. Alice isn't sure now. A nurse presented her with a form to fill out. Alice had to decide what would happen to the bodies. The babies would have been named Nicholas and Stephen had they survived. But now they had no names. Alice checked a box. Cremation. She would get to keep their ashes, and then everything was supposed to go back to normal.
Well, I was in the hospital for a few days on IV antibiotics. And And then I probably went back to work after that. I couldn't see any reason why not to, and I really did not want to be alone with my grief.
She felt sad, but entirely sane. And then, 10 days after she left the hospital,
I woke up and all of a sudden something was incredibly different. It was like the sun and moon had switched places in the sky. My thoughts were going 1,000 miles an hour, and I was thinking about stuff that I just knew wasn't true. Like I decided my obstetrician hated me because I had killed my children. I knew I hadn't killed my children, and I couldn't stop thinking about that.
she felt she had to confess. She hunted desperately for a pen and paper. Her own handwriting looked alien to her. The letters were tiny, like the tracks of bugs.
It was horror that I had done this thing that was the exact opposite of what I'd wanted to do.
As a brain scientist, Alice had studied mental illness for years, and now she knew that her own brain had cracked. It was terrifying to feel so crazy, but also fascinating. She had been diagnosed with an unusual type of manic depressive syndrome. She experienced both moods at once. Her thoughts were so sped up that they stuck together. But somehow, miraculously, Alice managed to drag herself to work at the hospital.
At a professional level, she was right on the money.
Anne Young was head of neurology at the hospital where Alice worked.
And it was like you can have a mental illness and still be fine at what you do in a job.
When a patient was sitting across from her, Alice was able to focus on the case. But as soon as the patient walked out of the office, Alice hid. And only Anne knew how to find her.
You had to peek under the desk because she was often hiding under there. And she was small enough so she could just curl up. And if she pulled in her chair a little bit, you wouldn't know she was there.
Anne also noticed the hieroglyphics all over Alice's skin.
The whole forearm was covered with written things on both sides, sort of scrawled around in different parts, almost willy-nilly. And the same on her palms and on the backs of her hands. And literally the entire door and inside wall of her office and other places, parts of her side of her desk and everything, all these Post-it notes.
Sand in the gears. About to explode.
Little pieces of things.
I can't think. I know what that is.
She thought were important to write down.
The shape of my thoughts being so certain.
That was when I was really worried.
Alice hallucinated. The trees whispered to her. When she looked up, the clouds were boiling. The streetlights reflected on the Charles River were so beautiful that she thought the beauty would split her in two, and she saw dead babies everywhere. The ghostly children from the sonogram floated around her.
Out my office window, there was a long canyon between two buildings, and sometimes bags would float up from 6 stories below, and I would think that's one of my babies. And I felt so bad that they were out there with no place. I wanted them to come back inside me, that they didn't want to be out there. They were born too soon.
She rode her bike to the crematorium and picked up the ashes of the twins. Officially, they had never existed, never had birth certificates. So how could they have gravestones? She wasn't sure what to do with them, so she stowed them in her desk. And then she had an idea.
I'd heard stories about people secretly burying their pets that they loved in Mount Auburn.
Mount Auburn is one of the most exclusive burial grounds in the country. It's dotted with ponds and rare trees, and with the graves of famous Bostonians from the 19th century.
And so I thought that was kind of the right place for these little unchristened babies.
It can cost $500,000 to buy a plot here. Alice decided to steal just a little space.
I wanted them to be in a place where I could visit them.
At the time, it all made perfect sense. Alice had begun to think of Mount Auburn as a mirror of the world inside her mind. This Gothic cemetery contained pathways into her own secret land.
And I often felt that there was this other kingdom, like the Night Kingdom, that was just on the other side of this world. Like right now, it's right there. And I felt that by being mad that I could put my hand through, I could just reach through and go and at least get into that kingdom a little bit, and that it was actually very beautiful. It was a whole new place, and I felt like my craziness had revealed something to me.
So her mind was in the Night Kingdom.
And I felt like I could see things that I couldn't see before.
But her body made its own perilous decision.
Like I literally got pregnant 3 months after I'd had the death of my previous kids, and everyone said, this is not a good idea. But I was like, I don't care.
There was a reason everyone worried about Alice. If her unborn children had died once, it could happen again.
I knew that I was pregnant again while I was still manic, and the world was sort of dilating and shrinking, and everything was kind of strange.
Alice began to vomit in the mornings, and her urge to write became as intense as the nausea.
I would get to work and I'd say, well, now I'm going to do some science, and instead I would just start writing more on the computer. I tried, at one point writing on my arm. I would write on toilet paper in the bathroom. That was also very difficult. So then I would try and make sure I had some paper towel with me, because that was easier to write on.
This malady, the too much writing, had a name: Hypergraphia. It's a rare condition that affects people with epilepsy and schizophrenia, and sometimes people with psychosis. In Alice's case, the urge to write was accompanied by her need to devour books and scientific articles. Day and night, she either spewed out her own sentences or gobbled up other people's books. She had gone word mad.
Robots and think I'm already dead, so why would I kill myself? I would have these pressured thoughts all the time. There were so many thoughts in my head. Very much the ideas would feel like they came into me from the outside. And I also didn't trust my memory. I felt like I had to write them down because they were coming so fast and they would slip away. So I have pages and pages of these half thoughts because I had to just write them down, but 99% of them were just garbage. During that period, I, in a sort of wonky way, read everything that I could, both scientific and also memoirs, and I loved reading depression memoirs.
In the 1990s, when Alice was in medical school, a memoir called Darkness Visible had been required reading for many young doctors. It was written by a famous novelist named William Styron.
Every doctor in the hospital knew Styron as a man of stature, but not because he had a Pulitzer Prize and not because he wrote the screenplay for Sophie's Choice. It was because he was the great god of depression. He'd written this book that taught even medical students about depression, not to mention all the patients who had read it.
Never let it be doubted that depression in its extreme form is madness.
Styron eloquently described his own suicidal depression. And even more important, he assured readers that they could recover as he had.
It has been established with reasonable certainty that such madness is chemically induced among the neurotransmitters of the brain.
When he published Darkness Visible, it became the book about mental illness, the one everyone read.
I got depressed and everyone said to me, you have to read the Bill Styron book. You have to read the Bill Styron book. If you read the Bill Styron book, let me give you a copy of the Bill Styron book.
Writer Andrew Solomon is a historian of mental illness.
It was the only book out at that point, and there was almost no one I knew who wasn't egging me on to read it, whether they had read it themselves or not. It was the great dawning of an era in which we could talk about those things.
From WAMU in Washington.
Throughout the 1990s, Styron appeared on TV and radio discussing his mental illness.
Still, his many awards and his best-selling books did not prevent a sudden descent into depression back in
This is Diane Rehm on NPR.
How would you assess your current state of mind?
Oh, I'm in very good shape.
if I may be so bold as to say that.
At that moment, Styron believed he had conquered depression, and yet he struggled with a lingering and ominous symptom. For decades, he'd been working on a war novel that he thought would be his masterpiece, and he couldn't finish it.
He attempted to gird his loins many times and move back into the rhythm of composition and to push that narrative forward, but he simply couldn't do it.
Jim West wrote a biography of Styron and was also the author's longtime friend.
He found himself short-circuited and frustrated, as if his imagination had deserted him. The question is whether his depression caused him to be unable to write, or whether his inability to write brought on depression. It's impossible really to know how those two operated with each other, how they fed each other.
And as Alice studied her copy of Darkness Visible, she became fascinated with that same question. Styron had described depression as a disease of creativity.
The words would come out of his mouth and just fall on the floor, and sort of gasping like fish out of water, and never reach the other person, and that's why he couldn't write, because the words would just die.
But Alice, of course, had the opposite problem.
Why is the world the way it is? Is there a God? Death was very sad. I think I'm already dead, so why would I kill myself?
She rigged up a waterproof pad on the handlebars of her bike and carried a waterproof pen so that even when she was pedaling to work in the rain, she could keep on writing. And then, in October 1999,
I was biking back from a psychiatry appointment in Brookline over to Charlestown, where my lab was. I was just passing a little playground by the Charlestown Bridge, and I had been thinking about, why am I hypergraphic? Why is the world the way it is? Is there a God? And then I had this revelation that maybe whatever was making me hypergraphic was also the same thing that would switch off when I couldn't write, and maybe I should think about this and I should write a book about it.
She began frantically scrawling this idea on her notepad. Cars whizzed by. Overhead, trucks rattled on the bridge. The world was all sound and fury, but she was taming it with her pen because she had just cracked the code. Alice scribbled the name William Styron. He was the key to it all.
It was so painfully obvious that a lot of what he was writing about was writer's block. He couldn't write because he was depressed, and then not writing made him more depressed. Now, at that time, I was kind of struggling with writing too much with this hypergraphia, which I was thinking of as a neurological thing. And it suddenly hit me that what he had was the opposite of what I had.
At the same time that Alice had a revelation under the bridge, William Styron would have been sitting on a dock near his summer house in Martha's Vineyard, his bare feet on the warm wood. Darkness Visible had been out for 9 years and gone into its 25th printing. By now, his mental illness was just a bad memory. He was the famous survivor.
I pulled out of it, and it's as if I had purged myself of this pack of demons.
But within a year, he will descend into another suicidal depression. And in 4 years, William Styron will show up in Alice Flaherty's office. He will beg her for help. He will become convinced she is the only doctor who can save him. And she will try to be that doctor. This is The Great God of Depression, a production of Showcase from PRX's Radiotopia. It's a 5-part series produced by Karen Brown and myself, Pagan Kennedy, with support from New England Public Radio. Music and sound design is by Ian Coss. Julie Shapiro is our executive producer. Excerpts from William Styron's work were read by actor Jack Gilpin. Find links, photos, and more information about this episode at radiotopia.fm/showcase. Coming up in Chapter 2, Alice gets pregnant again.
And all of a sudden, my brain was going 1,000 miles an hour, and I thought, oh.
And William Styron writes a book about depression that changes lives, including his.
And I remember the enormous relief I felt when I wrote the last words and said, I have said everything that I think a human being can say about the horror of clinical depression.
That's an additional sampling of Ian's wonderful music for this program. Thank you, guys. So just to kind of recap a little how this is going to go, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the themes that were brought up in making this podcast, and then we will open it up for questions. So, Julie, I wanted to start with you. About a year ago, Pagan and I came to you with a podcast idea, a narrative story about a famous man with depression and his eccentric doctor. Sorry, Alice, but we felt confident that there was enough suspense, texture, and history to lead people through 5 episodes. But from your vantage point, what was it about the story itself that convinced you to give it a chance? As you're probably more used to true crime pitches or more obvious narrative pitches, did you have any qualms about mental illness as a podcast topic?
Well, I think I was drawn to the non-obvious, actually, and how this seemed really like a unique idea. There were a few things in the pitch. Well, actually, the pitch was written beautifully, so I already had a sense there would be wonderful writing in this offering, and that, Radiotopia is always looking for content that can push boundaries and give people stories in new ways, and I felt like with Showcase, that was the mandate for the podcast to begin with. So it helped that I knew you a little bit, to be honest, and it helped that Pagan I knew from my zine making days when she used to write about zines, actually, so that was a name I was familiar with. We happened to cross paths in Cambridge, but really it was the strength of the idea. It was so unique. I'd never heard anything quite like this. We had access to, primary sources. Pagan's friendship with Alice was going to be a huge benefit because it would be as much Alice's story in her own voice as it would be the story of Styron's incredible journey. We had access to Styron's family through Alice, and so we'd have archival. Styron's wife, Rose, features prominently in. So there were all these clues that we were going to have a lot to work with. Pagan, it was also pitched as something with a literary tone, and you said you were inspired by S-Town, and so of course that idea of creating something that was very artful appealed to me, and your openness to approaching it in a kind of poetic way and playing with the sound immediately got me thinking, like, well, this could be actually a very unique and special thing. I also was, the topic is so important, it's ever timely, and there is a lot of reporting in radio out there about depression, but a lot of it's first person, or it's very scientific and about science and medicine and stories through expert interviews and things. And here I thought, well, we have the ability to get close to this topic in a very personal way, but through the lens of sort of a third person take on it. So it wasn't just going to be, Pagan's own story of this or that. It was going to be really Alice and Styron's shared story. So, and I was tempted by the complexity of weaving these two stories together over decades, and just that it would be a real experiment in how to bring this story out across 5 episodes in a way that the listeners would be able to follow through with it. And we had never done anything like that, so it was a great, good creative challenge for us as well. So it had a lot going for it, I'll say that.
And I should add that the podcast became sadly timely, just as we were putting the finishing touches on it. There were 2 high-profile suicides, Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain, and we thought, is there a place to put what happened to them in our podcast? But we felt that it was it made more sense to just talk about the issue of depression and what it's like to really viscerally experience it without, and it would just be on people's minds, I think, we thought. So Pagan, the germ of this story started with you and your friendship with Alice. Can you talk about why you wanted to tell it and why audio seemed like the right option, given that you're already very experienced in other forms of media?
Well, I was just thinking as we were listening about the beginnings of this project, and it really began with Alice. We were in a writers group, and then Alice would often show me her writings, which are amazing. And she had been working on, I had not known, we'd been friends a long time, but I hadn't known she had also treated one of the most famous authors of the 20th century and had this deep relationship with him during his final years, which were entirely undocumented. I mean, he stopped writing, and so there was no other person, or she was a person, an observer of his final years and his attempt to remain a writer even when he wasn't writing, and even when he was quite sick. And so she was working on trying to write about this, and I was caught up in this fury. And then she sent some of the writings to the New Yorker, which were rejected. And then I was so angry because I was like, this story is so much more, it's just so good. It has all the qualities of a New Yorker story, which is, it has suspense, it has gossip about, this famous literary celebrity. It has, she observes new things I haven't heard before about the human condition and about how our brains work. And I was particularly interested, in fact, when we were talking about it in the beginning, Alice and I and some of the people who were also in our writers group were talking about, why did he come to you? And we were trying to pull out more of the story. And it actually hadn't occurred to Alice in the beginning to write about the fact that Styron, that he came to her office because he believed his writing hand had gone dead, which was such a fascinating, weirdly metaphorical kind of mental problem that I was immediately fascinated. And then also the oppositeness, the fact that Alice had been hypergraphic and had not been able to stop writing, really, I just thought there was so much there. So and then Alice was just sort of tired of writing about it. And then I was still in my fury that I just really thought this was a really important story and a really amazing story that just had to be out there in the world. And it really had not occurred to me to take it over. I was just in my typical mood of being incensed about the publishing world, And then I just have always been such a huge fan of podcasts, and I'm not exactly sure how, but I really began to think that this could be a great audio story between having Alice here as such a great narrator and such a great character, and then all these wonderful archival materials we have of Styron. And I was just thinking maybe we can somehow weave all of that together, even though it's super tricky. And I was really interested too, as Julie mentioned, so much of narrative storytelling, nonfiction storytelling in podcasts now are true crime. It's all true crime. And so I was also really interested in, can you have that kind of big, suspenseful, multi-part story that isn't a true crime story?
That has the word depression in the title.
Yes. Well, the title actually wasn't clear at first. I think we were talking, and then I was, about a year ago, I was swimming in Lake Mattawa, and Karen came to swim with me, and I was like, I have this idea as we're swimming. Do you know all about audio? I know nothing about it. Will you help me? So that's sort of how
the rest is history.
Yeah.
So Alice, in the episode that we just heard, you are excruciatingly and generously honest about a very sad event in your life and how your brain went a bit haywire in trying to cope with it. And this isn't the first time that you've outed yourself as a so-called openly crazy doctor. That's her words. 20 years ago, you wrote a book about your compulsion to write called The Midnight Disease. And I'm going to play a clip, or we're going to play a clip from a later episode of the podcast in which Alice talks about how William Styron became her patient.
So my colleague, who was this senior neurologist who tended to wear a silk ascot, he was that kind of person, stopped me and said, well, I'm going to send William Styron, the writer. And I said, yes, I know. And he said, well, he was at McLean on the psych ward, and he started saying that he couldn't write because his right hand was paralyzed. So we hope you'll figure that out.
Alice was confused.
Why would you send a famous author to some, very recent graduate?
After all, she was just a junior neurologist.
So what's the catch?
She figured the senior doctor didn't want to deal with this whiny artist and his baffling complaint. And that's how she ended up with the great god of depression.
So can you talk about how your own openness about your own mental health issues it brought you William Styron, but how has it either enhanced your medical practice or informed your relationship with other patients?
I think it does help to know that your doctor has been through something similar to what you've been through. That was true of my own psychiatrist. She told me about a psychotic episode that she had, and it made me feel that she understood. She knew what I was going through. And but at the time when I outed myself kind of by accident. I was just so manic. I thought I was the most interesting person in the world, and everyone wanted to hear about me. So it wasn't bravery. Now it's excruciating. It's a little different to talk about it now. But when I first was thinking about writing this book, I thought, well, a lot of my patients are going. Yeah, I'll switch. Sorry. A lot of my patients are going to be just, nobody wants a sick doctor. And in fact, it was not at all a problem. I remember one guy who was from northern Maine and I thought very conservative. He said, oh, I saw a thing about you in National Geographic, because for various reasons there was a big full-page spread of me with writing all over me. And he said, oh, yeah, I saw that. Our doctor back home is crazy. About every 6 months, he runs down the street naked, and it's not a good idea in the winter in Maine. And he said, but and then they lock him up for a while. But, he's a really good doctor when he's sane, so we stuck with him. And I realized that for most of the world, people get ill a lot. Mental illness is very common, and it's actually doctors who have somewhat more stigma than a lot of patients do. And it made me realize how much of the stigma of mental illness comes from doctors who are anxious. And in fact, a lot of people, when I mentioned I was going to write this book about how, young Harvard doctor goes crazy, writes book kind of book, and they're like, oh, I understand what you went through, but you don't want to bring that up in public. And after a while, I was just like, fuck you, But that bias that doctors sometimes have, in many ways in a good way, but we're more afraid of illness than everybody else because we see it do what horrible things it does. Did I tell this? I can't remember if I told this story in the podcast about Bill Styron when he first got depressed and went to see a psychiatrist and said, I think I need to be in the hospital. And the psychiatrist said, oh, we can't do that. Someone might find out. Anyway, and Bill, had the presence of mind to say, look, I'm a writer. All writers get depressed. All my friends are depressed. What are they going to do, fire me as a writer? But most people who come to a doctor and get that kind of anxiety about their diagnosis, it's a really disturbing thing. But I do have to say one other thing about stigma, which is that depressed people bring a lot of the stigma on themselves. Because then when I was depressed, I was like, oh my God, what did I do? It was just like doing some horrible thing in public, the worst nightmare that you have of going out of the locker room with no clothes in junior high. That was what I felt like I had done to myself. So luckily, because I kept switching back and forth, like, I don't give a shit, oh, that was awful. I don't give a shit, oh, that was awful. I finally realized it was somewhere in between. I think that the biggest problem about revealing your story to patients, though, is you don't want to be the doctor that it's just like, oh, that's just like when I went crazy and I was in the hospital, and then tells you all this stuff that you really don't want to hear because it's their stuff. So that, I think, has actually been sometimes a hard part of being an out there doctor.
Do you talk about your experience with most of your patients, or is it just you have that empathy, you have that lens that is helpful?
These days, a lot of them know about it before they come in. I don't really bring it up except when I think it will do some rhetorical good. I know I took that med, the side effects at the beginning are awful, but just stick with it. People, I think, rightly take that kind of first-hand testimony as worth something. That being said, as a scientist, I think this is an N of 1 study. The fact that it helped me is like bullshit, So I always have this tension between the rhetoric that I can use to convince a patient and the knowledge that if I brought out all the papers that said this is why it's going to be good for you, it would have no emotional impact for them.
Okay. So let's turn a little bit to the sound and the music. As you guys were coming in and just after the podcast, we played a medley of music that Ian composed for this program. And you heard plenty of it in the first episode. So somehow it seemed to work, and I have no idea how you were able to put depression to music. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your process of depression, hypergraphia, other aspects of mental illness. How do you score something like that?
Yeah. So I guess when I was approaching the music, I'm really approaching it as part of a more like holistic sound, thinking about the sound design of the whole show. And I thought I'd do a little bit of show and tell that might help illustrate this. So when I say sound design, what I mean is mixing together all the different elements in a story in the sound. So if you look at, this is what this first episode we just listened to looks like on my computer, and you can see there are many different layers all playing out in time. We have the narration on the top, that's all Pagan's voice. We have the actualities, which are the interview clips, that's Alice's voice. We have ambient sound from when they're in the graveyard. We have lots of different tracks of music, archival audio. So all these things are mixing together, hopefully in service of really moving the story forward. And when I go to create the music, which is sort of the layer that I contribute most directly, I'm trying to create music that is of the sound world of the show and really enmeshed in the sound of the show, so that it's not simply just a layer that's tacked on or laid over the top, but deeply integrated. And I had a couple different approaches for doing that for this show in particular. So if we go to the next page, if you listen through the series, in episode 2, we learned that when William Styron was at sort of the darkest depths of his initial depression, he was saved in his own telling by a piece of music by Brahms. It's an alto rhapsody. And so because this piece of music figured so prominently in his own experience of depression, I went back to the score of this piece of music and started pulling out melodies and ideas from this music, so that even if, when you're listening to the show, you don't necessarily know this, but there's something of the resonance of his experience baked into the score. So here's one example. Is a few pages in, I found this melodic line, da 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 da, and I liked this little turn of phrase. So if you go to the next slide, I took that and I just reworked it into a simple melody, I changed the timing, I changed the instruments and the key, and then this becomes that opening melody we hear at the very beginning of the first episode. Yeah, so again, it's not lifted directly from the score, although I should say that the score is public domain at this point. It's about 150 some years old, so you can take from it if you want, but it's loosely inspired by the melody that's there. And there are a lot of the sort of more haunting melodies you hear in the show a lot of them are adapted from different parts of the score. If you go to the next slide, I'll give you just one more quick example. I knew that this idea of writing was central to both Alice and Bill Styron's stories, and I wanted some of the texture and energy of pencil on paper as part of the sound world of the show, especially when we're dealing with this idea of hypergraphia and this intense manic writing. So what I did is I took a piece of paper and a pencil and a microphone, and I just recorded a bunch of writing sounds. So we can hear some of what I recorded. And then what you can do with the wonders of technology is you can take all those sounds, drop them, go back to the previous screen, sorry, drop them in a computer, and then you can actually just play them on a keyboard. So this is my little sampler keyboard of all my writing sounds. So on the bottom there, you can just push all those buttons, and you get all those writing sounds. So now if we go to the next slide, then I can take those writing sounds and incorporate them in with guitar, strings, other sounds as part of the music that you hear. So we can hear a little bit of that.
This is the Alice theme, right?
Yes, this is sort of the Hypergraphia theme. And so the idea is that these different themes, because they're drawing on the thematic elements of the story itself, whether it's the Brahms, via Styron, or the writing sounds, that the themes themselves are evocative and part of the storytelling, as opposed to simply, like I said, a layer on top of the storytelling. So it's kind of like Peter and the Wolf, yes. So that's just a little insight into the process, and like I said, the idea is always to connect the sound, the music with the sound in a kind of holistic way.
Yeah.
Like that.
No, that's fascinating.
Can I add one thing? I remember when we all sat around at the first meeting and said, how can we think about this through a sonic lens? And we had this conversation about like what can be literal and, where's the edge between too literal and too much, and what can just be embedded in of the story. And I think you did that. I didn't know about the Brahms connection, but I felt the Brahms connection. Yeah. Something pulled this all together in such an authentic, cohesive way. And I really believe for producers out there, like you don't always have to hit people over the head, but if you invest that sort of internal logic into a piece that your listeners may never know, but you know, and that's enough almost. And they actually do know on a subconscious level. So it was like you totally proved it. Good job.
There's some other stuff like some of the spooky sounds you hear are the sound of electroshock machines. So there's a lot of stuff that, like you said, you don't listen and know, but there's something that the texture of it feels of the world, and
it was so great for us to be able to give you this jumble of sounds and writing, and have it come out of this machine as a fully formed, designed sound design. So one of the themes that we address in the podcast is stigma, and how instrumental William Styron's book was in normalizing depression, making the case for treating it as a chemical-related brain disease. Here's a clip from writer Andrew Solomon, who wrote his own memoir about depression, and he was a friend of Styron's.
If you were depressed, it was a terrible, dark secret that you hid from the world. And in the more open environment in which we now live, it can be difficult to remember how onerous that secrecy was.
Andrew Solomon is a writer and historian.
No one was going to keep you in your job, and nobody was going to let you come to their house and play with their children if you had a mental illness. There was a tendency to lump together all the mental illnesses, and those people were dangerous, they were crazy, they were unreliable, they were prone to possibly hurting someone, and they were pathetic.
And for many people with depression, secrecy could be deadly.
By and large, what it meant was that people with perfectly treatable conditions went untreated.
So, Alice, you talked a little bit about stigma a few minutes ago, but when you wrote your book, The Midnight Disease, that showed that a successful, respectable doctor can also suffer from and recover from mental illness, how much were you actually thinking about fighting back against stigma? And, is there still shame? Do you still see shame about having depression or other brain-related problems in your patients? Is it still an obstacle, or have we moved beyond that taboo?
I think there's less stigma now. Each decade there's less, and it's partly what we consider a disease is something that has to seem involuntary, and kind of there has to be a medical treatment for it. So talk therapy didn't really count, but as soon as there were antidepressants, then it's a medical problem, and each year we're a little bit more easily able to frame it that way. But the kind of work I do with neurology patients is people who have disorders of the motor system that actually affect their voluntary movements. So people like with Parkinson's or Tourette syndrome. And the same issue comes up with those patients too, which is that their family can't help thinking that what they're doing is intentional. A little kid with tics, for example, they'll say, well, you can stop your tics for a while. Why don't you just stop them forever, like stop doing it. And so there always is going to be this really complicated reaction to things that seem at least at some level voluntary. And even me knowing that someone with Parkinson's seems like he's not trying hard because he doesn't have enough dopamine to actually be able to try hard, it's still very easy to slip into an old pattern of recrimination and moral judgment rather than of medical judgment.
Okay. So it's better than it used to be, but not entirely gone.
Well, and I think Bill Styron is a great example of that, because when he wrote that book, he really was being brave, because, he had been depressed and hated himself. And I saw him hate himself again. When he got depressed later, he was so full of shame that he had let his fans down and his family down. And there was a really awful period where he was in my hospital at Mass General on the psych ward, and some of the other patients had hoped that he would read aloud from Darkness Visible, and he couldn't experience it as anything but them making fun of him for having created a travesty. And the the agony on his face when these other people who had gotten so much out of what he had written was just awful.
That leads into another clip that I want to play. Among the podcasts that I've gotten about this, among the comments I've gotten about this podcast is, were we worried that people who have a depression would be frightened by the fact that William Styron had a relapse? So let's hear the clip from episode 3.
My question was also about Darkness Visible, which I read in one great horrified exhale, inhale. Do you worry about becoming depressed again?
I think anyone who's suffered massive clinical depression is to some extent worried. One of the things that I think destroys people rapidly when they suffer clinical depression is the fact that it's the first time it's ever happened to them. And it's so cataclysmically ghastly that they're taken unawares. If it were to happen to me again, at least I would know what I'm facing, and that would be an advantage already.
Thank you.
So I want to ask sort of both Julie as the head of the network and Pagan as the writer. Julie, it was important to you that we included a trigger warning at the beginning of every episode and a suicide hotline number at the end of several of the chapters. What responsibility does a network have to protect listeners from sort of uncomfortable or possibly dangerous thinking patterns, outside of just telling a truthful story?
Yeah, well, there's, I guess as much as we've internally feel we do, I think it's quite a big responsibility. These podcasts go out to a lot of people. It was actually some time that I spent in Australia with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation that really kind of tuned my ears to being a little bit more sensitive to that. They're very careful about warnings and hotlines, and so that had just become something that I would automatically think about. But I think we didn't want to scare people away, so we wanted to invite anybody in who this story might resonate with. And I think one of the brilliant things about the story was that it directly spoke to lots of people, whether it was their own lives or their families or friends' lives, and it indirectly spoke to people who have wondered more about this and maybe know people removed. And so we wanted to make sure anyone coming to listen felt safe, and even if it didn't occur to you that you might need a hotline, hearing that at the end makes you think, oh, there might be people who are hearing this that could, and that it's an important thing for art to also support an audience. And it felt obvious to me we needed to do something. Now, how much every episode, twice an episode, we talked a lot about that internally, about how much was too much, or is there such thing as too much? But I don't actually think it ever hurts, so I wanted to err on the side of consistency and regularity with it.
And then Pagan, maybe as writer, co-producer, how much were you thinking in terms of what impact might this have on the listener versus, we became very enmeshed in our story and wanting to tell it the way it happened and as compelling as possible. So how did you balance that?
Yours. The other one is cursed. Well, honestly, going into it, I wish I could say that I was really thinking about the listeners and their state of mind and protecting them, but I really honestly didn't even realize this was a story so much about depression in the beginning, because when I knew that Styron was very sick at the end of his life and developed this idea that his hand was dead, and that fascinated me, but I didn't really realize the extent to which he'd gone into a second depression. And I think that's what's really, and then there was all kinds of things I discovered about his life as I did the deep research and as we interviewed people, and then as I did tremendous amounts of archival research, finding lectures from him, reconstructing his whole life. And that is the really seductive thing to me about telling true stories, is when you go into it, you think you know what the story is. But the exciting thing is you realize you're wrong, and you begin to find these other pieces of it that you didn't expect. And there's these kind of amazing like gems that pop out, and you meet people, and you just go into these worlds that you didn't expect to be in. And just even interviewing people often, you really come in with an idea of what you're going to get, and then often what you find out is just so much. I'm always amazed at the weakness of my own imagination, because I'll imagine, it must have gone this way, and then the true version of it is always just so much more interesting than what I imagined. And another, I really, because if you go to a party in Cambridge or Northampton, now everybody's going to talk about how many milligrams of Prozac they're on, and it's really not very stigmatized, at least around here, to be on meds or have been depressed or had some kind of episode. It's not a big deal in certain circles, but. So I wasn't even thinking about the stigma, but part of nonfiction storytelling, particularly when you go into even 20 years in the past or 30 years in the past, is you have to build the world of the past around your characters. So, they're it's a different world. Even the 1990s was such a different world, and so. Styron actually in 1988 is when he outed himself in the New York Times op-ed section, which is it was actually exactly 40 years ago this year, and that's exactly the section I write for in the New York Times, which was kind of weird. And I hadn't known he had outed himself there when the project began at all. This is just something that came up, and then I was reading through. The reason he wrote Darkness Visible is that after he talked about how he had been a mental patient and gone through depression and had recovered, and the reader response was unbelievable to this piece, because very few people in the 80s were talking about how they had just come out of a mental hospital. It was very stigmatized back then, and these letters, which I found in this archive from all these readers talking about, I was in a mental hospital, or my son committed suicide, or my wife is really struggling with mental illness, and they weren't able to talk to their friends or neighbors. It was this terrible, dark secret. And so that kind of brought me back to, wow, it was a really different time. And so part of, I think, what we had to do in the storytelling with sound and with archival tape and with Styron's own story was to really bring you back into that time where there was a whole different level of stigma and a whole different way that people were talking about things, so that the meaning of him coming out and writing this book would really become clear. And yeah, none of that was anything I anticipated at the beginning. So I think that's what's that's what I'm in it for. It's the really exciting kind of sense of discovering a world you didn't know was there.
So I'd like to be able to get to folks' questions. Do we have a microphone that folks can talk into?
You can have this one.
Yeah. Give you guys the bad one. Oh, do we need a couple minutes? Okay. No, we don't. Okay.
I just want to say that in Writers Group, Alice has knitted. You've knitted 2 huge caftans, several scarves, a hat.
Maybe we should explain why I knit.
Yeah, well.
It's really not about the cloth. It keeps my hands busy. It keeps them away from my iPhone, and my family says I'm less irritable.
We're learning a lot about you tonight. So do we have a...
Karen, can I ask you a question?
Yes, you may.
How was this for you? You're leading the conversation, but this was a really different experience for you, and I'm wondering how it felt, because you did a great job.
Thank you. Well, We'll try it without the feedback. You know, I'm used to doing a lot of news or a lot of short-term features that I have, you know, a few weeks to work on, or maybe even less. So to be able to dig into one story was amazing, and to be able to use archival material, and to be able to take a trip to Martha's Vineyard and meet Rose Styron, William Styron's widow, and to be able to work with a sound designer. Usually I have to do all that stuff myself, and it's not nearly as creative. So it's sort of dangerously seductive, and I want to do it all the time. But it took us a year, so, but thank you. All right, so do we have a mic, or should people just come up and ask the question? What do you guys think? Oh, we're almost there, okay.
Hello. Hi.
Okay, all right, so why don't you guys raise your hands, and Vanessa will go over and with a mic. If anyone...
Any advice, Klein?
I'll repeat the question. So
my experience is that it's easy for me to share that with white affluent audiences, educated audiences. But I've also been doing some work with NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness. And it's absolutely shocking and so sad that in a lot of other communities, only 50% people who suffer from mental illness don't even get treatment because they're too ashamed to acknowledge it. And in people under 17 years old, 60%. So I don't want to get too comfortable that we've come a long way and talk and joke about how many milligrams of antidepressant are. This is still a pretty significant issue. And lastly, I don't have a question. I just want to thank you because this at least brings it to the attention, and I hope it will get to the attention of some people on Facebook, here, but beyond this
well, thank you. Yeah, I suppose by definition, those who have come out to a listening night about a podcast about depression are already sort of a little bit more educated and don't consider it a giant taboo. But thank you for your comment.
Oh, I think we're going to try this again. Sorry. Okay.
Hello. Okay, great. Congratulations. I'm hooked. This is my first time listening, and I'll go home and binge. So I have a question for Pagan and maybe for Alice. And it does also involve the idea of stigma. I'm interested in how you chose or didn't choose not to use the word madness, because it is a word that can be stigmatized, but it also has this beautiful literary bent to it. And then I was also thinking, what is madness anyway? Thank you.
I used the word because it felt like, is this even picking up? Okay. It felt like what I was going through. And actually, another word that I couldn't let go of was hysteria, especially after my children died. You know, all the stuff that the Greeks used to say, which seems very just awful, I think, from the outside, about the wandering womb driving women mad. That's what I felt. I felt like my womb was trying to get out of my body to find my kids. And the kind of solemnity of it, and also the horror and the ridiculousness of it, like something's hysterical. All of those overtones actually seemed fitting to me, but I think it's a little bit like the N-word. If someone told me I was hysterical, I'd spit on them.
Actually, that's a great question, because I struggled with using that word, but actually Styron uses it in his subhead of Darkness Visible, and if my memory were better, I could remember exactly how it goes, but it's something like a memoir of madness. And so and he very much also owns that word, and that there's I mean, I think, what he more or less said was, depression is such a bleh, He hated the word depression because it was so, it's like cornflakes. It's just it doesn't get at, the horror and pain of it. So he was always searching for a word that, and he kept wanting to use brainstorm, which is also just, I think maybe it acquired other meanings after he thought of that, but he was searching and searching for the word. So it's, it's so difficult to kind of find the word that has the power, the punch that carries the feeling of what somebody's going through, but also isn't stigmatizing. So that's a great issue.
That also, I thought a lot about, well, from a practical point of view, when you're doing a piece like this, you need to vary the words that you use. You just can't use the same word over and over. So there's a little bit of trying to vary the terms that we use. One thing that I wondered about by using madness, madness sounds like eccentricity more than illness. And I think one thing that we were very cognizant was how do we make sure we don't romanticize mental illness and depression and make it sound more exotic than it really feels like. And I know for Alice talked about how that there was, in her case, a positive. There was an upside when she was going through the grips of her hypergraphia. There was a certain amount of creativity that she lost when she got treatment, and we talk about that later in the podcast. Whereas I think William Styron saw there was really very little upside. It really muted his creativity, and I think we were constantly trying to balance, how are we don't want to stigmatize it, but we also don't want to not respect how horrible it can be. So,
Anybody
other
else?
questions? Oh, there's one over there.
If you could come over here, I think that would be great. Just for the mic purposes.
For feedback purposes.
Right. Thank you.
Hi. So I was really struck by what you're doing here, how an audio situation, how you're speaking to the issue in a different way, that you're kind of humanizing what mental illness represents in a way that gives people access that perhaps is different to something that is written. And I was wondering what the response has been to this podcast. You kind of alluded to the fact that this is something that isn't really out there in podcast world. And I'm wondering if you see the potential to kind of go back to this issue with different, for want of a better word, different flavors of, there are obviously very many different dimensions to mental illness, to give people access to this.
Yeah, I'd be curious what you guys have heard in your lives of what people have said that maybe could spark the next chapter.
Yeah, you said that.
Did I say that? Well, I have heard from a number of people who sort of felt like they could out themselves in a way of having depression, and these are a number of people that I knew fairly well but hadn't really talked to me about this side of them, and I thought that was interesting that they felt certain permission to just admit this was really hard. There was no light bulb moment, but I think there was a certain comfort to having it talked about in as visceral way as I think we tried to do. That was one of the things I heard, yeah.
I'll say that we track the Radiotopia response pretty obsessively, and there's been a lot of very, very positive. People are, we experimented by dropping all 5 episodes at once, so a lot of podcasts, you get a new episode every week, and we were playing with the idea of it being so literary, and it was the summertime, and maybe this could be like summer reading. So we made every episode available at once, and unfortunately, I would love to come up with a substitute for binging, but we said, here's something you can binge at once. And a lot of people did. We got a lot of response that said, I just tore through the whole thing, couldn't stop listening. And so I think it was successful in that way that I know, Pagan, you really thought about how do we draw people through this and keep them, evenly interested. And I think it did that. and it created a stronger response because people had it all at once. It's been reviewed in some really high-profile places, which we're very proud of. The New Yorker has a podcast review column by Sarah Larson, and she talked about it, and The Guardian, and so it's gotten a lot of international press. But it's, that's all fine and great and wonderful, but it's really the individual responses we see when people feel compelled to tell other people that they just heard this and it was amazing, that we feel like we're really making a difference. And podcasts really spread through word of mouth, so if people love something, they tell other people, and I feel like this is going to just continue to live. It'll have a shelf life that never expires because, of course, the topic is endless and timeless, and so it's there. It can be a resource into the future. We'll be, with Mental Health Awareness Month coming up in November, we're going to be sure that we're targeting, giving a new round of promotion for it so people looking for content can find it. And I would say I haven't really, all podcasts get panned somewhere, but I really haven't seen, and no one has come to us with any deep problems with the series.
One thing that I've heard, and I thought that was interesting, I don't think this is meant as a criticism, but just something to point out, is that we talk about a very particular situation and a lot of unorthodox methods that Alice worked on with William Styron, who was his own person, and everyone has different ways of dealing with their own mental illness. In his case, he went through electroshock therapy to limited results. And in the end, it was Alice's relationship with his widow, his wife at the time, Rose. They decided to give him a party in his honor, which could have been a disaster, and it once was a disaster. But in this case, it sort of brought him out of his depression. A lot of people have come to me and said, well, that's probably not going to work for most people, and not everybody gets a giant party in New York in their honor. So I'd be curious, Alice, whether, do you think it's helpful for people to hear about a particular, this was a very interesting story, but not completely typical as far as treatment is concerned. Here you can use maybe that one.
I think I should keep my answers short because there are a lot of people who want to ask questions. I guess a lot of people say my clinical methods are a little bit, free for all, but I also want to maybe liberate people to try different things. Now, the fact that Bill Styron had a 500-person party in New York is a little bit irrelevant. Everyone can have a surprise party for their family. I mean, that's not really the part that was unorthodox. I do want to change subject, though, and go back to the ECT question, because actually having watched him go through ECT, it was very important to say that he got a lot better. Every time he had it, he got better very rapidly over the first 6 cycles, and then he would get to a point, first when he was really sick, he'd ask for it, then he'd get to about that point and say, this is awful, we have to stop. And so he himself would say at that point that it had been a failure, but it was for everybody else to watch. He went from being catatonic to being able to interact and say, okay, I want to go home now. But let's have some more questions.
Yes, there's a nice orderly line forming, so if you want to answer a question or ask a question, help yourself.
Hi there. Whoop. Hello, Karen. I'm Karen's neighbor.
Hi, Dan.
That's my purpose here. Thank you very much, and thank you particularly, Alice, for continuing to give the presentations. So I'm also of the doctor and sometimes neuroscience persuasion, and have done a little time with ups and downs of mood and sampled lots of psychotropic drugs. And the really interesting thing that I observed when I started doing that is that it's sort of like someone who picks up the hood on the car. You kind of see all these things whirring, and you see what exactly makes you yourself. What you turn up, what you turn down, what's going out of control, what you want to put a lid on, and so forth. And I'm curious how someone who likewise has a fairly intimate idea of what's going on up there, how this experience changed how you kind of view yourself and your thoughts, and how you as a self feel like you got put together.
I don't think taking pills ever changed my sense of who I was. I was always very interested in what it was doing to my energy level or getting rid of the hallucinations. But what really changed my sense of who I was watching myself get manic and then get depressed. And I actually gained a lot of flexibility about thinking what I could do. I was a pretty rigid, uptight Harvard type, and having been kind of bounced around where there were periods where I'd do anything, it kind of stuck. So that was good. But the thing that a lot of times people will feel like their mental illness is very much something outside of them that landed on them and took them over, and it's in opposition to them. And that's actually a good prognostic sign. I felt like that was me, and the more manic I got, the more I felt like I was getting more like me, and I could see that was a ridiculous state. It was like a reductio ad absurdum. And also when I got depressed, I would become more and more like myself, and it would become, like just unbearable. So I think seeing what I was like in the purest, uncivilized sense wasn't very flattering.
I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions, and then there's going to be a reception, and you can continue to ask questions more in private, and there'll be food.
Great, so we'll take the last three here.
Thank you. I have about 15,000 questions shooting through my head, and I seem to have landed on a couple of the most esoteric of them, so I apologize in advance. So I think your writing team, and it's a credit to you, Karen and Pagan and Julie, for being able to develop this narrative arc that I kind of picked up on when William was describing what he was going through as a war against his depression, how he was fighting the battles on, because it wasn't just personal, it wasn't just going through the episodes that he did, but it was also, his reputation, because he was able to write Darkness Visualized, and having the weight of that, the New York Times op-ed, the book, and then all the public appearances, and even the parties going through that. I'm wondering what that war was really, what was there a villain? I don't mean to anthropomorphize this or fetishize this in a way that, there's one magic bullet, but who was the villain here?
Pagan, you want to take that on?
Sure. I think you're referring to, there's sort of mention that he was working on this novel that he couldn't finish, a war novel, and it was quite literally a war novel. And he had actually, and here's another thing we had no idea about when we started this, but Styron, though he was this brilliant author who'd written Sophie's Choice and some of the great novels of the 20th century, he had been a lieutenant in World War II in the Marines, and he had been on a ship that was headed to Japan, and they were going to invade, his company was going to invade Japan, and he was probably going to be killed. Yeah, right after Iwo Jima. So you're aware, maybe and
I pre-listened to the podcast.
Oh, you've already listened. Yeah. So anyway, for the people who haven't heard it. Yeah. So he, then he really was. They pulled back the troops because the Hiroshima bomb was released, and he really had this unbelievable guilt through his life about feeling that his life was saved because this bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. And that was something that only came to light as we were talking to his daughter and his biographer and other people in his life. And so that was, I don't want to say it's his rosebud, because I think that there was also biochemical things going on that we will never understand. But it is really interesting that there was this piece of himself he could never get on the page. And I think as creative people here, we can all relate to that feeling that, there's some things that we can get out, and then there are the really, really important stuff. It often feels like we can't get out, there's this deeply private experience or pain or guilt or whatever it is. It just, there's nothing there's no way you can package it. It's trapped in there, and I think that becomes part of an element in the story later on, that this unwritten novel, but it was really this inability to express this deep sense of his place in history. And there was actually a turning point, and I'm not sure if this quite comes through in the podcast, because we ended up cutting a lot out, putting a lot in, cutting it out. But he sort of translated that experience into Sophie's Choice and into the Holocaust, and that same kind of sense of guilt and and of taking on this big historical moment as one person, and so I think that he did, that was sort of like supplied the pizzazz, the juice behind Sophie's Choice, but there was always something left.
And Alice, did you want to add to that? Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if that was your question. I had understood it to be when you're having a war against depression, what is it a war against? Is that right?
Yeah, I guess that question could be.
Well, if that wasn't your question, we can take the next one. But people will often say, if depression is me, this is a war against me. It's not like taking an antibiotic to get rid of the bugs, and so that is pretty complicated.
And I think it's also worth mentioning that Pagan and I are not doctors. Alice is. So we had to work on finding a narrative to kind of explain the story, and we had to choose what to leave in and what to leave out. And I think we don't know I don't know if anyone knows exactly what caused William Styron's depression, what causes anyone's depression. It's probably in most cases a mixture of many, many things. William Styron lost his mother when he was very young. I meant, we weren't really able to explore that. I can't imagine that wouldn't have an impact on your life later. So I think that's one of the struggles as storytellers, is that you can never tell the total, complete story, and especially about something as complicated as mental illness. So I think with that, do we want to try and? Yeah, let's take one more. Yeah, let's take one more question.
Thank you. Thanks again for bringing this to a public forum. I think it's really important, and the music was amazing. My question is this: and it's just a perception or from your experience, Alice, working with people, when people are actively depressed or manic, or what capacity do you think people have to, I knew this wasn't going to come out well, what capacity do you have to acknowledge the effect it has on your loved ones and your family? And it was sort of I'm a primary care doc, so I sit with a lot of people and hear them tell their stories, and it always strikes me that it's a very personal and sort of ego-centric illness. And in the podcast that came through to me, I don't know anything about anybody's family from that first podcast. Just what have you noticed?
Yeah, so it's partly, if I talked about the effect on my husband, he would get very upset. He doesn't want to be in anything about that. But I think when I was depressed, I was much more aware of the effect I was having on my family, and then that would lead to more guilt. And it was like that Dickens character in David Copperfield, where the woman keeps saying about, I know I'm such a burden to you, and becoming more of a burden the more she said it. When I was manic, I didn't give a shit. And I kind of knew at some very meta level that I should. But there's a stereotype that when depressed people take themselves to the hospital, and manic people are taken to the hospital by their relatives because they're so much more annoying. It can in both cases be very self-centered, and you forget that there are other people in the world that can help you, and you don't feel that you can ask for help. So yeah, as a doctor, you see people who are just knotted up inside themselves, and then a family that may be very supportive, trying to help and not being able to because of the way the illness isolates the patient.
So whenever I'm wrapping up an interview, I always ask if anyone has anything to add that has not come up. So do any of you guys want to add anything else?
Just a quick one, and that's just to say at some point in the process, I remember saying, so why are we doing this? What do you want out of this? And I think it might have been both of you, but Pagan, I remember you wanting people to think differently about depression and the experience of that. And I know that personally I had that feeling when I finished the 5th episode for the first time and thought, wow, I've really been touched in a new way. And I felt like that goal, for me at least, has been satisfied. And I imagine that's the case for a lot of listeners. So I just want to say, thank you for making it. And I think it achieved what we have set out to do. So I hope you all who haven't heard it will listen and concur. But yeah, good. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, for letting us do this. Thank you all for coming out. This was great. And if you need to do any stress eating, there is food in the back there, and we'll all be hanging around. And in about 20 minutes or so, we'll play that last bonus episode if anyone's interested, but totally optional.